The day I left my hometown is one I'll never shake from my memory. It was a chilly autumn morning, the kind where the crisp scent of damp leaves fills the air, sharp and refreshing all at once. My entire life was packed into the bed of my old, battered pickup truck, and I was determined. This was the fresh start I desperately needed. I had to get as far away as I could from the suffocating weight of betrayal. Leaving wasn't a decision I made lightly, but it was the only option. The lies, the deceit. It had all torn apart everything I knew. The only way to heal was to put distance between me and those who had destroyed me. Hours later, I found myself in a sleepy, almost forgotten town that seemed like it was waiting for me. The pace was slow, the people were kind, and the place just felt right. As I wandered around, I came across a dilapidated gas station and garage, standing there like a relic from another time. The place had been on the market for ages, but where others saw ruin, I saw potential. I made a lowball offer, and much to my surprise, they accepted. That crumbling property became the foundation of my new life, the base from which I could finally rebuild. One Saturday evening, I found myself at my regular seat in the corner of the local tavern, savoring the calm. That bar had become my sanctuary, the place where I could let my guard down and unwind. Not long before, I'd bought the gas station and repair shop for next to nothing. The previous owner had been desperate to unload it after it had sat empty for 2 years. But while others saw failure, I saw an opportunity. My first major move was to add a small retail store next to the gas station, something to serve the town after the grocery store closed for the night. I also rearranged the fuel pumps so they faced the store, making parking a whole lot easier for the customers. The store took off quickly, becoming a hub of activity, especially in the late hours. It was open 24/7, but the real rush came between 7 p.m. and midnight, while the garage stuck to its normal hours, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. on weekdays, with special weekend projects. At first, the bar down the street wasn't thrilled about me selling liquor, but the new business brought in extra income, created jobs, and, in the end, the community ended up benefiting more than anyone expected. After I revamped the store's layout and product placement, things really took off. A woman I hired to help run the store was key to its success. Before long, we'd paid off the equity loan, and the demand was so high that I had to bring in extra staff just to keep up with the weekend rush. By Friday and Saturday nights, we were selling mountains of snacks to bargoers, and by Sunday, the place was packed with people grabbing cold beer at prices that couldn't be beat. On that particular Saturday evening, I was enjoying a double Sam Daniels on the rocks, with a splash of water and a wedge of lemon. I just wrapped up an 8-month project restoring a vintage truck, a family heirloom for one of my regulars. He joked about driving it until the day he died and getting buried in it. The bar was always quietest from 4 to 7 p.m., the perfect time to unwind before the evening crowd rolled in. The regulars, mostly farmers, would often bring their daughters in for a little post-dinner fun. In the 6.5 years I'd been in town, I'd built a solid reputation and earned real friendships. People here looked out for each other. If anything felt off, they noticed. My ritual was simple: 1 drink every Saturday night, then home. But that evening, everything changed. When they walked through the door, my stomach dropped. The woman with him was my ex-wife's twin sister, and the guy next to her, the boy I had once called my son. All the memories I had tried so hard to bury came rushing back, painful and raw. For so long, I had been blind to what was right in front of me. The boy, now a man, looked more like his real father than ever, and in that moment, the truth hit me like a punch to the gut. The truth I'd buried deep inside, the truth I'd never wanted to face, was staring me in the face. What the hell could they possibly want now? I watched as they spoke to the bartender, handed him a photo, and then left just as quickly. I felt a momentary sense of relief. My new look, with the long, unkempt hair, thick beard, and slimmer frame, had made me nearly unrecognizable. A few minutes later, I sent a text, almost without thinking. "Come home when I can." About half an hour later, Camden, the bartender, came over and sat at my table. "What were they after, Camden?" I asked, not even sure I wanted to know. They told me a woman named Angela is dying of cancer and wants to make amends, Camden said, his voice steady but low. They heard you were living here and came to check if the rumor was true. They asked for a picture of you, but I played dumb and told them I didn't recognize the name. I lit a cigarette, ripped off the filter, and took a slow drag, trying to keep my hand steady. Angela's my ex-wife's twin sister. The kid with her? The one my ex swore was mine for years. You think they were being honest? Camden thought for a moment, his eyes narrowing. There's some truth in what they said, but I could tell they're hiding something. They're not here just to make peace. I nodded, feeling the familiar knot in my stomach. Deception had always been their weapon of choice, masked in false sincerity while they twisted the knife deeper. As Camden returned to his duties, my mind drifted back to nearly 7 years ago, to the day I finally walked away from everything. They never thought I'd actually leave. They laughed as I walked out the door, thinking it was just a reaction to a stupid prank, completely oblivious to the bombshell I just uncovered. Our youngest child wasn't mine. He was my brother-in-law's. That revelation set everything in motion. A family member, someone who'd grown tired of Angela and her sister's endless scheming, had dropped the evidence in my lap. She'd called them black witches, feeding off malice, and warned me to get out before it was too late. Earlier that week, I discovered a new life insurance policy they'd taken out on me. A $4 million payout for my accidental death. A friend, a wise woman who had always kept her ear to the ground, had told me in no uncertain terms to leave. So I did. My work truck was already packed with the essentials, and without a second thought, I hit the road. 2 states away, I started over. Part of me blamed myself. I'd gotten Angela pregnant when she was young. At 18, I buckled to family pressure and married her. One child led to another, and before I knew it, we had 3. But to Angela, it was all just a game, a way to get ahead. After I left, she told our daughters, "Your father will come back when he gets his sense of humor back." But when the sheriff showed up at her door with divorce papers, the laughter stopped. "Are you Mrs. Angela Chanter?" he asked, the papers in his hand. "Yes," she answered, still smiling like she had nothing to worry about. "Well, then you've been served," he said, handing her the envelope. I imagined the smile fading from her face as she realized what I'd done. Dissolved our marriage without an ounce of hesitation. My lawyer had been thorough. He documented everything. Assets, debts, and the DNA report that confirmed Angela's affair had lasted for an entire year. The divorce petition had it all: receipts, photos of their hotel trysts, and other incriminating evidence. And along with the papers, I included a letter telling Angela's husband I was suing for child support, infidelity, and defamation. The smugness that had been a constant in their lives quickly turned to bitterness. The joke, for once, wasn't on me. This time I had the last laugh. For years, Angela and her sister treated me like their personal ATM, sure that anything I touched would turn to gold. Angela and the kids had lived in luxury, without ever lifting a finger. But they didn't know what I'd quietly been doing behind the scenes. I'd sold 3 of our businesses, paid off all our debts, and even made a profit off our 2 apartment buildings. I'd canceled every credit card, pulled my name from joint accounts, and signed over my share of the house to her. Half of our total net worth was now cash in my pocket, and the monthly income that once flowed freely to her had dried up completely. $10,000 a month? Gone. Did her sister ever understand what it cost to use me like that? Probably not. My attorney froze their assets before the subpoena arrived, leaving them with nothing once the divorce proceedings were over. Still, he handed Angela a portion of their losses as a kind of reimbursement. When she asked him why, he simply said, for him, this was never about the money. It was about principle. He hopes this will help you start over and learn from your mistakes. But Angela refused to finalize the divorce without talking to me first. So we remained legally separated, but still technically married. I had no interest in speaking to a woman who had lied to my face for years. Forced to support herself for the first time in her life, Angela quickly discovered how fast money disappears without a steady paycheck. I made sure all my important mail was forwarded to a rented FedEx mailbox, which would then be forwarded to my work address. I knew Angela and Nicole too well. They thrived on manipulation and revenge. It wasn't a matter of if they would come after me, but when. Their family had a way of holding grudges, and my disappearance would only make their anger burn hotter. The longer I stayed out of their reach, the worse their retaliation would get. Until Nicole showed up at the tavern, I thought I'd escaped them. But seeing her walk through that door made it clear. The game wasn't over. After finishing my drink, I slipped out the back door, careful not to be seen. I cut through the empty lot behind the tavern and made my way to my pickup. Just as I unlocked the door, a man approached me. "You're a hard man to find. Jacob John Chanter, I presume?" he said, his voice low but clear. "How do you know that name?" I asked, my guard up. "My name's Owen Gilbert. I'm married to your oldest daughter, Ella," he replied, his expression neutral. "That could be either a blessing or a curse," I said dryly. "Does she act like her mother?" He smiled faintly. "Why I'm here has nothing to do with her. Some things need to be sorted out. That would have been a lot easier if your mother-in-law had just signed the damn divorce papers," I said, my frustration showing. "What divorce papers?" Owen asked, his eyebrows shooting up in surprise. "Follow me," I said, leading Owen through the small town. We drove past rows of familiar buildings, their faded signs reminding me of a life I'd left behind. After a few minutes, we turned down a long driveway that ended at the farmhouse I'd built with dreams of a fresh start. In my home office, I pulled out the divorce papers and let him make copies, trying to avoid any unnecessary conversation. Owen didn't need to know the house wasn't technically mine. I'd built it for the grandame, hoping one day she'd finally leave her old place and settle here. Owen seemed competent, well-educated, and sharp, but I couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that he was somehow entangled in one of Angela and Nicole's schemes. He connected his laptop to my Wi-Fi and began downloading files. As he worked, his expression changed subtly, his brow furrowing, his lips tightening, as though he was processing something that didn't match what he'd been told. At one point, he printed a letter from Angela's attorney to mine, acknowledging the agreed property division but refusing to finalize the divorce without meeting in person. "Do you think Ella knows the truth?" Owen asked, looking up from the papers. "That's something you'll have to ask her yourself," I said, keeping my voice flat. "But here's a question for you. Does Angela really have cancer?" Owen looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Who told you that?" "Nicole and John told the bartender today," I replied. "But I know it's a lie. Angela's fine. She's living in a common-law marriage with her former attorney and is pregnant with his second kid." Owen sighed, a weary sound. "She's the one who sent me to find you. She claims the divorce needs to be finalized so she can remarry." Owen dialed Ella's number and put her on speakerphone, giving me no chance to avoid the conversation. "Did you know your mother lied about the divorce not being finalized?" he asked her. "What are you talking about?" Ella replied, her voice tense and confused. "Mom told us Dad abandoned us, drained everything, and disappeared. If it weren't for our stepdad, we wouldn't have made it." "I'm sending you the legal file," Owen said, cutting her off. "Read it and call me back." As they talked, I grabbed 2 beers from the fridge, popped the tops, and handed one to Owen. "Why didn't you tell Ella you found me?" I asked, sitting back and watching him closely. He took a long sip, the beer looking oddly out of place in his hand. "Ella and I have only been married for 2 years, and we just had a baby 3 months ago. For now, I'd rather keep this to myself. Everyone else thinks I'm working on an unrelated investigation." He pulled out a badge, showing me he was a police officer with the Paradise Police Department. I checked their website quickly to confirm his identity, then raised an eyebrow. "So what led you to me?" "It started with an accident report from a few months ago," Owen explained, his voice even. "Ella filed a missing persons report about you, and it eventually came across my desk. After cross-referencing it with an insurance claim ruling in your favor, I started following the trail. It led me here." I stared at him, piecing things together. "And you still didn't tell Ella?" "After reviewing your file, I realized there's something bigger going on," he said, shaking his head slowly. "For example, where's the $250,000 in cash Angela was supposed to get?" along with the house deed? And why is everyone lying about what really happened? I leaned back in my chair, a bitter chuckle escaping my lips. Sounds like you've been fed as many lies as I have. Just then, Owen's phone rang again. It's my wife. Keep it down, he said, answering the call and putting it on speaker. Hi, honey. Ella's voice came through, strained. Where did you get all this? Is it true? Have we really been lied to all these years? John doesn't even know who he really is, and neither do I. My sister Grace will lose it. She always defended Dad and stopped speaking to Mom because of it. This completely contradicts everything we were told growing up. Ella continued, frustration evident in her voice. Mom and Aunt Nicole gave Dad no choice. They've been manipulating his life for years. And now I find out the divorce hasn't been finalized because Mom refuses to sign? What's really going on here? It's true, Owen confirmed. I got the details from your father's lawyer's widow. I had to go out of state to track her down. Her husband kept duplicates of all the records, including the divorce petition, which it turns out your mom was served with the day your dad left. I scribbled a quick note for Owen to pass along to Ella. Tell her to talk to her great-aunt Mabel, assuming she's still alive. Owen nodded thoughtfully, relaying the message to Ella. Then he hung up and looked at me. Ella's asking about the $250,000 that Angela was supposed to get. She wants to know why her mom won't finalize the divorce. Why is everything so messed up? I stood up, pacing the room. Angela and Nicole are creatures of habit. They've been playing games with everyone in our lives, manipulating them into believing their lies. They've done it for years. Owen took another sip of his beer, and I leaned against the desk, weighing the options. Ella needs to know the truth. She deserves to understand what's been going on all this time. It's about time we take the fight to them. Owen's expression darkened, and he paused before asking, Do you want to know about your kids before I leave? Not yet, I said firmly. Not until I'm sure you are who you say you are. For all I know, this could be another part of their game. And while you're at it, look into my lawyer's sudden death. If Angela's planning to sue me, what makes her think she can win? Owen's face paled at the mention of the lawyer's death. I'll look into it, he said quietly, clearly processing the weight of what I just dropped on him. We exchanged numbers and made plans to stay in touch. After Owen left, I took a long, winding route back home to ensure I wasn't followed. The walk gave me a chance to think. My life had gotten so much better since I left paradise. Did I really want to drag it all back into the fire? But I knew Angela and Nicole. They wouldn't stop. Not until they had what they wanted. When I stepped through the door, I was greeted by the best part of my life. 2 little kids charging at me, their arms outstretched, full of laughter and excitement. I scooped them up, their giggles filling the air, and kissed their soft cheeks. They were everything to me, just like their mother. Dinner's almost ready. Ida called from the kitchen, her voice warm and familiar. I set the kids down, ruffling their hair, and went to wash up. As I stood there, scrubbing away the dust from the day, I marveled at how far I'd come, how far we had come. From a man broken by betrayal, to a father, a partner, and someone who could stand on his own 2 feet again. As I waited for the meal, I could feel the town's quiet attention on me. A couple of familiar faces at the counter glanced over with recognition, but no one said anything just yet. I wasn't sure if it was the passage of time or the way I looked now. Clean-shaven, different. But something told me that I wasn't the same Luke they remembered. When Sam, the owner, appeared from the back with a dish towel slung over his shoulder, a wide grin broke across his face. He didn't say anything at first, just crossed the room to slap me on the back. Well, I'll be damned, he said. If it isn't Luke. I thought you'd vanished off the face of the earth. I've been busy, I replied with a smile. I see you're still holding down the fort. You bet. Some things never change. Sam's eyes flickered over to the few patrons who had noticed me, the whispers starting to spread like wildfire. Felt good, in a strange way, to be noticed again. For years, I had been invisible, gone, forgotten, and now here I was, about to stir up a hornet's nest. I spent the next hour eating the meatloaf and catching up with Sam, who was full of questions about where I'd been, what I'd been doing. I dodged most of them, talking about the store and how I'd relocated to a quiet town. I wasn't here to draw attention, at least not yet. When I paid for my meal, I noticed the whole bar was watching me. The server had spread the news, and Sam, always the showman, made a little announcement. "Luke's back, folks. Don't go spreading any rumors. But if you want to hear the story, you better catch him now." The place went quiet for a beat, and then, like a wave crashing in slow motion, people began talking. Some congratulated me on my return. Others just stared as if they couldn't quite believe I was standing there. I did my best to stay calm and act like everything was normal. When I stepped outside, I saw Owen's car parked just down the street, a discreet distance from Ben and Bonnie's. He was watching the scene unfold from inside. I made my way to the truck, feeling the weight of everything about to go down. The pieces were in place. Driving back to Mabel's house later that afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I was used to keeping my head low, doing my best to stay out of sight, but now I was almost hoping to be seen. By the time I parked in front of Mabel's house, the word had clearly spread. There were whispers from neighbors, and a few cars I didn't recognize were parked outside. Owen and Ella had returned from making some rounds, and Mabel was in the front yard, preparing to leave. "Looks like you made an impact," Owen said as I got out of the truck. "Everything going according to plan?" "More or less," I answered. "Now we just wait for Angela to bite." Ella was holding their baby, and Grace had joined us. Her eyes still filled with that mix of concern and hope. She'd been quiet since I arrived, trying to come to terms with everything. The truth had been a lot to process, especially the fact that her mother's lies had tied her family's future to a web of deceit that spanned years. "Dad," Grace said, pulling me aside for a moment, "I just want to know one thing. Why didn't you come back sooner? Why wait so long?" "I had to make sure it was safe," I replied honestly. "It wasn't just about me anymore, it was about you, Ella, and the kids. If I'd come back and things went sideways, I wouldn't have been able to protect anyone." She looked at me, still processing. "So you really think they were planning to kill you?" I nodded. "I'm sure of it. Do you think they're still capable of something like that?" I paused before answering. "Yes, and that's why we have to act fast. We can't let them think they have the upper hand anymore." Grace seemed to digest that, then gave me a small, uncertain smile. "I trust you, Dad. Let's end this once and for all." As night fell, we settled inside, the plan already set into motion. Camden. I'd head to a few familiar places to ensure Angela knew I was back in town. Once she made her move, we would have everything lined up to take her down. But something told me it wouldn't be that simple. The deeper we dug, the more dangerous things seemed to get. But I had come this far, there was no turning back now. The game was on. The next day, I started my morning early. The sun was barely up, and I drove around Paradise with a few stops in mind. The first was the bank. They didn't expect me to show up, not after all this time. It was still hard to believe how many of the old haunts had been left untouched by the years. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of the county clerk's office, the whispers were already there, swirling through the small town like wildfire. People saw me. Some nodded politely. Some stared. Inside the clerk's office, I requested a public record check, an old habit I hadn't shaken since my days as a detective. The woman behind the counter, her name tag reading Cheryl, blinked when she saw me. "You're back?" she asked, clearly surprised. "Back to wrap things up," I said, keeping it vague. "Is the divorce file for Angela Taylor still accessible?" Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, and her gaze flicked to my face. I could tell she was trying to place me. The woman leaned forward, lowering her voice. "You don't want to mess with her, Luke. She's dangerous. Has been since before you left." "I've heard things." "I'm not here for gossip," I interrupted. "I need the file, and I need it now." Cheryl sighed. "Fine. But you should know, once you open that can of worms, there's no going back." I nodded. "I know." Minutes later, she handed me the file. I didn't need to read it in detail to know it contained the kind of damning information that would blow the whole case wide open. I tucked it under my arm and left without another word. The plan was coming together, but the clock was ticking. We didn't have much time before Angela and Nicole would make their move. That night, as I sat with Owen and the rest of the family, I knew the next step was crucial. I had to show up in all the right places. Let the town see me. Let them see the ghost of Luke that had returned. Alive, well, and ready to finish what he started. And this time, no one would get away with their lies. Brad's face drained of color at my words, and for a moment, he just stared at me, his mind clearly racing. He hadn't been expecting me to know about the full amount, and the shock was evident. His grip on the pistol tightened for a brief second, but he didn't make any immediate move to escalate things. $4 million, Brad? I repeated, keeping my tone even. The full payout, double indemnity, the whole shebang. And you, my friend, are just a pawn in this little game. They used you just like they used my lawyer. Just like they were going to use me. Brad's expression shifted from shock to anger, but there was also something else. Fear. He'd clearly realized that the noose was tightening around him. His whole demeanor faltered, and he took a few hesitant steps back. I don't know what you're talking about, he muttered, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He still wasn't sure if he could talk his way out of this. I think you do, I said calmly, watching him carefully. Angela and Nicole, your lovely sisters, figured they could take me out of the equation, collect the payout, and clean up their mess. But they underestimated one thing. I'm not as stupid as they think. Brad's hand shook as he held the gun, but his expression was hardening. His mind clearly made up. He took another step back, trying to regain control of the situation. Where's Ida, Luke? He demanded, his voice tense. Tell me, and maybe I'll forget about this whole thing. Funny how you're suddenly so interested in her. After all these years, I said, leaning back in my chair, taking another sip of coffee. I didn't want to give him an inch, not when I knew how dangerous he was. But if you think I'm going to betray her, you're wasting your time. Brad cursed under his breath, then raised the gun, pointing it straight at me. I'm done playing games, he said, his voice low and menacing. I'll make you talk, Luke. You don't want to make me do something we'll both regret. I studied his face, watching the anger and fear war within him. He was just a man who'd been manipulated, but in his eyes, I saw a desperation that I knew all too well. He didn't want to pull that trigger. He wanted something, control, information, power, but he was too afraid of losing it all. I decided it was time to push him. You think killing me will fix things, Brad? I said, leaning forward just slightly. Do you honestly believe that? Because I'm not the one who's going to be in trouble after tonight. You are. Brad hesitated, his hand wavering slightly. The gun dropped a fraction of an inch, and I knew I had him. You're being used, Brad, I continued, keeping my voice steady. Just like I was. Just like Mabel was. Just like everyone else who's been sucked into this mess. Angela's gonna throw you under the bus. And Nicole won't think twice about it. She never has. A bead of sweat formed on Brad's forehead, and I saw the shift in his eyes. He was beginning to doubt everything he thought he knew. You're saying Angela and Nicole? He trailed off, still not fully comprehending the depths of their manipulation. Exactly, I said, my voice firm now. They've already thrown you to the wolves. If you walk out that door right now, you're a dead man. You can't trust them, Brad. They'll leave you in the dust, just like they've done to everyone else. For a long moment, he just stood there, his gaze flicking between me and the gun in his hand, the tension thick in the air. Then, to my surprise, he lowered the gun, his entire body sagging in resignation. He dropped the pistol onto the kitchen table with a sharp clink and sat down across from me. I don't know what the hell to believe anymore, he muttered, rubbing his face. Angela said this was a quick in-and-out job. But now, it feels like I'm drowning in this shit. I didn't respond immediately. I just watched him, letting the silence settle between us. Brad wasn't a killer. He was a man pushed too far by people who knew how to manipulate him. But deep down, I could see the flicker of guilt in his eyes. You're not the first person to be used, Brad, I finally said, my voice softer now. But you can still make things right. You can stop this before it gets worse. His head jerked up, a spark of hope in his eyes. "How?" "By helping us," I said simply. "We've got enough to put Angela and Nicole behind bars. But we need you to step forward. If you can give us something, anything, about their involvement in the insurance fraud, the arson, or anything else, it'll make a hell of a difference. It's your shot at redemption." Brad looked torn, the internal battle playing out on his face. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, his eyes flicking toward the door, then back at me. Finally, he sighed, as if the weight of the decision was too much to bear. "I can't be the fall guy anymore," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "I'll talk. I'll tell you what I know." Before I could respond, there was a sudden knock on the door. The sound was sharp and unmistakable. "Who is it?" I called out, keeping my voice neutral. "Police," a voice called from outside. I stood up quickly, giving Brad one last look. He was already on his feet, glancing nervously at the door. I motioned for him to stay quiet. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of a heavy boot hitting the floor outside. "Stay quiet," I whispered to Brad, as I made my way to the door. "We'll deal with this together." I opened the door to find two uniformed officers standing on the porch, their faces serious. "Everything okay here, Mr. Gilbert?" one of them asked, his eyes scanning the room behind me. "Everything's fine," I said smoothly, glancing back at Brad, who was now sitting back down at the table, trying to appear calm. "Just moving some things around. What can I help you with?" "We've had reports of suspicious activity around this house," the officer said, his voice cautious. "We just wanted to check in and make sure everything's all right." I nodded, offering them a friendly smile. "No problem. Everything's under control. But I appreciate you checking in." The officers exchanged glances, but after a moment, they nodded and turned to leave. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to call." I closed the door behind them, and once I was sure they were gone, I turned back to Brad, my mind already moving ahead. "Let's go over everything," I said, "before this gets any messier." Brad nodded, and for the first time, it seemed like he was ready to stop running from the truth. Owen nodded, his tired but relieved smile spreading across his face. "That's exactly what I'm saying. The divorce will be finalized as soon as the judge signs off. It's all part of the plea deal they're offering Brad, so we can move forward without any more delays. You two can finally get your life together." Ida's eyes welled up with tears, and she reached for my hand, squeezing it tightly. "I never thought this day would come," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I leaned in and kissed the top of her head, feeling the weight of everything that had happened finally start to lift. After all the years of uncertainty, the fear, and the distance, it felt like we were finally going to have a chance to build the future we'd always wanted. "Neither did I," I said softly. "But here we are, and it's going to be okay." Just as the moment settled, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Sam. "Got a call from the DA's office. They're fast-tracking everything. You'll need to make a statement later today. Brad's testimony is solid. He's cooperating fully. Angela and Nicole are done." I showed the message to Ida, who nodded in understanding. "I guess that means the real work begins now," she said. I stood up, ready to face whatever came next. The nightmare was finally coming to a close, but there were still loose ends to tie up. A lot had happened in the last 24 hours, and I couldn't afford to let my guard down just yet. "I'll head over to the DA's office later today," I said, glancing around at my family. "It's almost over. Just a few more steps and we can move on with our lives." Sam, who had been listening quietly from across the table, raised his glass. "To family," he said, his voice warm, "and to finally seeing justice done." Everyone around the table raised their glasses in agreement. My parents, my siblings, and even Owen all joined in the toast, their faces filled with a mixture of relief and anticipation. The years of tension and betrayal were finally behind us. We spent the next couple of hours talking, laughing, and catching up, savoring the rare moments of peace. My daughters, Ella and Sophia, filled me in on everything that had happened since I'd been gone. They shared stories of the ups and downs of their lives, their victories and losses, and the lessons they'd learned along the way. As the breakfast came to a close, I could see the lightness returning to everyone's spirits. It was as if the heavy cloud that had hung over us for so long was starting to dissipate. We had all survived the storm, and now it was time to rebuild. Owen stood up, tapping his glass for attention. "I'll be heading out to finalize Brad's testimony and start the paperwork for the divorce," he said, smiling at me. "This is your time now, Luke. Time for you to make the decisions that matter." I nodded, feeling a sense of finality wash over me. This wasn't just the end of a long chapter. It was the beginning of something new, something better. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, smiling at Ida and our family. "This is where I belong." Ida wrapped her arm around mine, resting her head on my shoulder. "I'm just glad it's over," she said. "We can finally be a family again. We've waited so long for this." As we left the restaurant and made our way back to Mabel's house, I felt a surge of gratitude. Despite everything we'd been through, the betrayals, the threats, the fear, there was one thing that had never wavered: my love for Ida and our commitment to each other. No matter what came next, we would face it together. That afternoon, I made my statement to the DA, walking through the process with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. With Brad's testimony and the evidence that had come to light, Angela and Nicole's fate was sealed. Their actions had finally caught up with them, and justice was on the horizon. Later that evening, I sat outside on the porch with Ida, our hands intertwined. "You know, we've got a lot to look forward to," I said, gazing out at the horizon. "Our future is just beginning." Ida smiled, resting her head against my shoulder. "I'm ready for it," she said softly. Together, the next few weeks went by in a blur of paperwork, court hearings, and moving into a new place. With the divorce finalized, we were able to start fresh, building a life that was free from the shadows of the past. Brad's testimony had been crucial, and with his cooperation, the authorities were able to piece together the full extent of the conspiracy. Angela and Nicole were both facing multiple charges, and the trial was set to begin in the coming months. Their future was uncertain, and they had no one left to turn to. As for me, I focused on my family, on Ida, on our boys, Carson and Hunter, and on rebuilding the relationships I had with my siblings. Mabel had already settled into her new home with Ida, and our lives slowly began to settle into a routine of normalcy. Ida reached over, taking my hand, her fingers gently squeezing mine. Her presence was a constant source of calm in the chaos that had surrounded us. "Florida and California, huh?" I said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Disney with the kids sounds perfect. But I think we need something a little more us when we get back from all this craziness." She smiled, the sparkle in her eyes never dimming. "I know. We've earned it. After everything we'd been through, we both deserve to be in a place where we could fully focus on each other." Ida leaned back in her seat, looking out the window at the changing scenery. The sunlight caught her hair, and for a moment, I couldn't help but think about how much she'd grown. How much we had grown, both as individuals and as a couple. From the moment I met her, I knew she was someone special. But now, after everything, I realized just how much she had been the driving force behind my survival. The next morning, as we woke up to a beautiful, clear day, we both felt like we were starting a new chapter, one without the looming threat of the past. We decided to take a trip into town to run a few errands, and while we were out, we stopped by a jewelry store. It was time to buy that engagement ring I'd promised Ida. I could see the anticipation in her eyes as the jeweler presented a few options. "I think this one," she said, pointing to a ring that caught the light perfectly. The three intertwined bands seemed to represent everything we had been through, separate lives, yet always destined to come together. "It's perfect," I said, taking her hand as we made our purchase. Later that evening, after a quiet dinner at home, we sat on the porch, the cool night air swirling around us. Our thoughts were filled with the future, but also with the quiet peace that had finally settled in. "I'm so glad we're here," Ida said softly, leaning into me. It feels like we're finally in a place where we can breathe again. We are, I replied, my voice steady content, and we'll make the most of it together. The next few months went by in a blur of activity. We moved into a small house just outside of town, a place that was ours. No more drama, no more manipulation. The neighborhood was quiet, friendly, and everything we had hoped for. Ida and I began planning our wedding. It would be a small ceremony, just our closest family and friends, a celebration of everything we had overcome together. The first few weeks in our new home were blissful. Carson and Hunter were adjusting well to their new surroundings, and we all began to settle into a routine. I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that our children were growing up in a safe, loving environment, far away from the chaos of our past. Then, as the day of our wedding approached, I found myself reflecting on everything we had been through. We had learned to fight for each other, to lean on each other, and above all, to love each other through it all. And now, as I stood at the altar, waiting for Ida to walk down the aisle, I knew that this was the start of something even more beautiful than I had ever imagined. When she finally appeared in the doorway, her smile lighting up the entire room, I knew, without a doubt, that this was where I was meant to be. We exchanged vows, surrounded by our family and friends, and as I slipped the engagement ring onto her finger, I couldn't help but think of how far we had come. What had seemed impossible just a few short months ago was now our reality. The rest of our lives had begun, and there was no place I'd rather be than right here, with Ida, our family, and our future stretching out before us.